Okay. Some of you guys know me, some of you don't. Yeah, I'm faculty in the geology department here at K-State, and actually my geology interest is in the rocks of the Flint Hills, so it's kind of my vocation as well as my avocation. And I'm just going to try to give you a quick overview of the geology and also a little bit of its impact on other things like vegetation cover and things like that. This is a map of the geology map of the whole state. I just put up this to give you some context. So each of these colors represents a different unit. Actually, these represent groups of formations. And what you notice is just kind of the striped pattern, because geology of Kansas is fairly simple in that regard. But you start down here in the southeastmost corner of the state. Those are the oldest rocks. And as you move progressively from southeast to the west, you're going more recent in time. So as you probably know, sedimentary rocks are stacked in layers, and those rocks that are at the bottom of that stack are the oldest. So as you go through a stack of rock layers, you're going through time. So a sequence of rock layers is a timeline, right? So this is a timeline, and the reason you get this pattern is for two reasons. One is that as you go from southeast to the west of Kansas, what's happening to the elevation of the state? Goes up, right? 1,000 feet or so. So you're going higher, right? So if you have a stacked layer, you're going higher up. And this has all been planed off, been eroded off. And the other thing is that the beds actually dip somewhat. So they dip down to the west slightly. So the combination of those beds dipping to the west and you're going up higher elevations causes you to go up the stack of rocks, right? The Flint Hills is this band right here, this kind of blue and purple band right here. That's the Flint Hills. And those are the rocks we're going to be talking about. And the rocks of the Flint Hills were formed during, it's called the latest Pennsylvanian through the early Permian in geologic terms. And that time period is around 290 to 270 million years ago. So this band, what makes the Flint Hills topographically is the characteristics of the rocks. And that's what we're going to talk some about here to begin with, is why the Flint Hills has its characteristic topography, right? You go to the east, the topography is going different. You go to the west, the topography is different. And the reason is the characteristics of the rocks that were formed during that time period. And the characteristics of those rocks result in the topography that we see. So, this picture from the nature trail. And a couple things that you immediately see when you're out in the Flint Hills is you look at the horizon and it's pretty flat. But there's also kind of a terrace topography to it, right? So there's an upper kind of terrace or platform, then it goes down in steps. So you can see that here even better with the way this is lit. So again, you have this upper surface, this upper platform, and then the rocks terrace down. The reason they have that topography, one is the rocks are fairly flat lying here. And the Flint Hills, the rocks of the Flint Hills, consist of these alternations between more resistant rocks, limestones, and less resistant rocks. We'll just simply call them mudstones for now. Okay? And the alternation between those resistant rocks and non-resistant rocks creates this terrace topography. So if we look at it, unfortunately, there aren't too many places in the Konza where you can actually get nice exposure of the rocks. That's why we have road cuts. Right? So this is 177, almost near the interchange with I-70. And this is the Florence Limestone here at the top, which is the limestone layer that basically makes the top part of that platform in the Konza. It's the thickest limestone in the Flint Hills. You go down to the interchange there with I-70, you can see that really thick limestone there. Very resistant, very thick limestone that caps the Flint Hills over most of its area. But you can also see here's another thinner limestone. And you have these colorful mud rocks, gray, green, brown, red kind of colors. And they alternate. So you have these packages of mud rocks, fine-grained sediments, and then limestones, then mudstones, and limestones. And those mudstones, because they're soft, they weather really easily, and those give you the slopes. The limestone, which are really resistant, give you the platforms, because they're resistant. Limestone, in our kind of climate, we have a fairly dry climate here. Limestones in a fairly dry climate are weather resistant. They dissolve slowly, with kind of the precipitation, the slightly acidic precipitation slowly dissolves limestone. But in a fairly dry climate, limestones tend to be very resistant. If you went to Florida or you went to the East Coast, it's the opposite. Okay? Limestones erode very quickly because of high precipitation. Out here they don't. So we have resistant, they make the resistant layers, the mudstones are the non-resistant layers which form the slopes. So every one of those little terraces, when you look out over the Konza, you tell your people that your kids or people that you're leading that they look out over the Konza and they see those stair steps. Every one of those little stair steps is a limestone. And the slopes in between are these mudstones. So there is the Florence. And this is, again, taking that same array around that interchange with I-70. And in addition to being resistant simply because they're limestones, one of the reasons that they're both resistant and that gives the name to this area is because these upper limestones are rich in flint. Chert, it's the same thing. Chert, flint, same thing. I'll pass this around. We'll see some today, I'm sure, on the hike. Chert is produced chemically. It is silica. It's the same stuff that makes glass, window pane glass, same composition. So it's silica, silicon dioxide, but it's formed chemically within the rock. So actually, if you pass this around, you'll notice that there's actually fossils within it. And so the chert, or flint, actually grows chemically within the limestone and replaces the limestone. So it's a result of a chemical reaction that alters the calcium carbonate of the limestones into chert or flint. And flint is very hard. It's called cryptocrystalline, which means it's very, very, very fine grained. And just like window plate glass, it's hard. And if you break it, it has sharp edges. Right? And silica also doesn't weather. Right? Silica is very resistant to chemical weathering. It's hard, so it doesn't break up. So what happens is the limestones will slowly weather away, but the flint won't. The flint weathers out and accumulates on the surface. So you get this layer of rubble on the surface of the landscape of these broken pieces of chert. That's why it's called the Flint Hills. And that has a lot of significance, both for the biology and ecology of the Konza, and also why we still have virgin prairie here. Because you end up with these thin soils, lots of flint in the soils and on the surface, so it prohibited the area from being plowed. So whereas a lot of the other parts of the Midwest were plowed, the virgin prairie was turned over and turned into agriculture, that didn't happen in the Flint Hills. Because the soils are too thin and covered with these flint nodules, pieces of flint, which prevented the area to be plowed. So it actually ended up preserving the prairie in this area. And this is what they look like. This is a close-up, again, from the Florence. And lots of people ask, how does this stuff form? And it's actually a very difficult question. Some of the chert, like in this case, appears to replace burrow structures. So slight differences in the characteristic of the original rock or sediment, maybe its porosity and permeability and things, resulted in preferential alteration of the burrows as opposed to the rest of the limestone. Sometimes the chert replaces gypsum nodules, evaporite nodules. We'll talk about that in a second. And in other cases, it actually replaces the fossils themselves. So I'm going to pass around, I'll just pass around one of these. Now this is actually probably from the Florence. This is a brachiopod. We'll talk about the life of this time later. But if you look at the shell looks kind of white. And that's because it's actually not the original shell material. It's been replaced by silica, just like the flint nodules. It's the same composition. So the original shell material has been replaced by silica. So if you see a fossil, it has this kind of white color, white appearance to it. It's also harder. It's been replaced by silica.
Where does the silica come from?
That is what everyone asks. Yes, and that's an excellent question. And we don't know the answer. So on that last question on the sheet, do you need to know the answers to everything? Well, sometimes nobody knows the answer to the question. That happens to be one of them. Yeah, that's a really big question because there's a lot of silica represented on in that chert. And the usual sources for the silica are things like ash beds, volcanic ash beds. And the trouble is there aren't any. But there could have been, because there could have been rocks above this that are gone, right, been eroded away, but there's no obvious nearby source of ash beds, volcanic ash beds to provide the silica. It's been suggested, one of the suggestions is that grassland plants, prairie plants, often feel really stiff. You like cut yourself on grass blades sometimes, right? Really kind of stiff. That's because those plants have little silica bodies in them, little microscopic structures made of silica embedded in the tissues of the plant, which gives the plant some rigidity, also makes them, again, feel kind of stiff and rigid. And when those plants die, or when there's a fire, when there's a prairie fire, plants burn, the silica is then left behind and dissolves and goes into the groundwater. So you can actually, if you measure the silica content of the groundwater after a prairie fire, the silica content of the groundwater goes up. So some people have suggested that maybe this prairie grasslands have been around for 30 million years. in the mid-continent. And so maybe over that time, that's where the source of the silica came from the plants that were growing on the surface. But the real answer is we don't know. We don't know where the silica came
Keith, what made the burrows?
from. Again, we don't know. They are similar to burrows that are produced by things like crayfish. But I'm not aware that we know for sure what the burrow makers. There's also burrows that are made by bivalves. There are some burrowing bivalves. Burrows don't look like this for those. They're more straight-looking burrows. But there are clam burrows. Again, probably some arthropod is a good guess, like a crayfish. But we don't know.
Can you tell me why you don't think there's volcanic?
Well, it's just that there isn't any. If you go to the west in the Cretaceous, there are ash beds within the Cretaceous and other, but not in eastern Kansas. So we don't know if there ever was. It would have been in layers that are now gone, that were over top of our head, that have now been eroded away. But there's no direct evidence that there was any ash beds in the Flint Hills area to source the silica. So it's just, there could have been, we just don't know, because that's one thing about geology is erosion happens more than deposition does. So most of the fossil record is nothing. Most of the geologic time is represented by nothing. So you have big gaps, big time gaps, of which rocks have been eroded away or never deposited. So again, we don't know if there were ash beds here or not, but there aren't now, and that's the problem.
Because this was underwater.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
Okay.
So other parts of America, are there also, let's say, the Florence Limestone with chert in it? Is this the only place where it's exposed? Or is this a unique layer period?
Yes. The Flint Hills area, this particular interval of geologic time in Kansas, in the mid-continent, is where the flint occurs. In other words, there isn't flint in the Pennsylvania and southeast Kansas, there isn't flint in the Cretaceous. It's located within this particular band. It's what is one of the characteristics of the Flint Hills, is the limestones are very flint rich. That's unique to that geologic area. Yeah.
Is there any flint elsewhere outside of North America?
Oh yeah. And in North America, I'm just talking about Kansas.
So
definitely.
Are there prairies that are rich in flint that you can compare to look at this plant hypothesis, the silica?
I've never been asked that question, and I don't know the answer. I'm modeling here. I'm modeling. I don't have to know everything. One thing I wanted to show here is, see, here we are. This is actually at the top of the nature trail. And so this is one of the platforms formed by one of the limestone. In this case, it's the 3 Mile limestone. And the soils at the top of those platforms, one very thin because they're on top of the limestone. And this is also where the chert is concentrated, right? So the soils are thin there. And so the plants that are growing on those platforms, on those limestone platforms, are different than the plants that grow, say, on the slopes. Another thing that you'll find, this happens to be the Cottonwood Limestone here, notice there's a line of trees and scrub right along the base of those limestones. That's also a result of the geology, in that as in the Flint Hills, when rain falls, normally limestone is really bad for transporting water. pretty impermeable, water can't go through it. But these limestones are all broken up and have lots of fractures in them, what are called joints. So if you walk out and look at the limestones, like they're in blocks. They break up into blocks, right? So they have these fractures that crisscross the limestones. So the water will flow down through those fractures, through the limestone, to the bottom of the limestone. Underneath the bottom of the limestone are these mudstone layers, which are actually impermeable. They don't let the water go through. So the water trickles down through the limestone, hits the bottom of the limestone, can't go down anymore, and so it goes laterally, goes sideways, flows along the bottom of the limestone until it finds an exit at the surface. So this is where all your springs are. And springs are going to flow out at the base of those limestones. So there's more water there. So therefore, that's where trees and scrubs and shrubs can get started, because there's a higher water content at the base of those limestones than there is above and below. So if you look at, again, out in the Konza, you'll see that the trees and shrubs form lines on the Konza. And those lines of shrubs, again, are along those limestone layers. But here you are in one of the slopes, so this would be underlain by those mudstones. They weather more deeply, the soils are thicker. So for example, the grasses are more lush, they have deeper roots. Plants are taller and healthier because they have more soil. And if you get down to the bottomlands, so down in the floodplain areas, at the bottom is where you have your really tall, big blue stem and things like that. Because again, they have really good, fertile, deep soils. So the types of plants that are present in different parts of the prairie are being controlled by the geology.
Keith?
Yeah.
Before we get off the Florence and Chert, if I went out to Goodland and dug down roughly 2,500 feet to find the Florence, I wouldn't find any flint there, is that correct?
No, it should. There would be flint in the subsurface too. So yeah, and that. Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty with regard to how this. When did the chert form? We don't know. Was it during a particular time period that most of the chert formed? Did it form over a long period of time? Did it form? Apparently, it didn't just form near the surface. So that might be a negative as far as the idea that it was coming from the plants that are growing on the landscape. But on the other hand, groundwaters can move pretty deeply into the subsurface. But yeah, everyone's always curious about the flint, and it's really frustrating because we really don't know. We really don't know when it formed, where the silica came from, we know the chemistry, that's fairly easy. The chemistry is fairly straightforward in how it happens. But the other kinds of questions are we just don't know the answers to.
So Keith, you said that the mudstone layers are impermeable to the water runoff, right? But yet they weather more easily. So is that a contradiction, or
No,
is the water not involved in the weathering?
Yeah, clays. Clay minerals are kind of flat, two-dimensional minerals. They're made of sheets as far as the mineral structure is concerned. So what happens is that those, particularly in more shale units, which are often the ones that are immediately associated with the limestone, so they break often in sheets, they're thinly laminated, is that those little clay minerals are lying on top of each other like a stack of paper. And that produces a barrier to water flow. But on the other hand, clays weather very easily. So it isn't a contradiction, it's just that, it's the same reason, for example, we have the buffalo wallows. The reason we have buffalo wallows is because the bottom of those wallows have been coated by the consistent work of the bison to concentrate clays in the bottom. And so the water can't seep out of those hollows very easily, and so they hold water and become little wetland areas. So clays, muds actually, you think of mud as something that allows water to go through, it actually doesn't. Mud is actually kind of impermeable. So it does seem like a contradiction, but it's because the way those little mineral grains stack on top of each other and prevent the water from going through.
It's like pottery.
Yeah, they absorb, the clays absorb water, but they don't let it go through. Yeah, it's like potting clays would be an extreme example of that. All right, so, oh no, not yet, okay. So I want to say a few general things about the rocks themselves and what their broad scale interpretation, environmental interpretations are. As I said, these rocks were formed during the late Pennsylvania or early Permian, about 270 to 290 million years ago. What was the world like then? That's questions people have. What was the world like 280 million years ago? It was a very, very different place. Okay. One of the things was that the paleogeography was completely different. Instead of the current paleogeography that we have now, all the continents were swept together in one giant continent called Pangaea, one supercontinent. And this is a paleogeographic reconstruction of that time. So we had this one giant landmass that included almost all of the continental land masses on the Earth at that time, that stretched almost from pole to pole, maybe a little more to the south, didn't extend quite as far to the north. And Kansas would be located right about there, which is about 10 degrees north of the equator. So at the time, Kansas would have been equatorial, just maybe about 10 degrees north of the equator, on the western margin of this giant supercontinent that extended almost from pole to pole. Another thing you notice about this reconstruction is down here. It was glacial time, okay? And that's going to be very, very important because that's what generated the kinds of alternations in rock types that I just talked about. That's a consequence of that. So this is an ice age, just like the more recent Pleistocene ice age, which just ended 10,000 years ago. Right? This was another, it was called ice house climate in Earth history. Okay. Two main ice house intervals in Earth history. A couple other ones, but the two main intervals, one of them was at this time and the other is right now. So this was an ice age in which the southern part of Pangaea was glaciated. And here's a blow-up reconstruction of what would have been western Pangaea at the time. Here is Kansas, and notice we have this sea here that is occupying part of Kansas. Also extends all the way down here into Texas and connects to the ocean out through Texas and what's now Texas and New Mexico. So this is an idea of the topography or the paleogeography at the time the rocks were being formed here in Kansas in the Flint Hills. Now, remember I said that the Flint Hills is characterized by limestone, mudstone, limestone, mudstone, dozens of times, dozens of repetitions, starting from the Pennsylvanian all the way through the early Permian. So again, here we have the same thing. So here we have a limestone, these variegated, colorful mudstones, limestone, limestone, mudstone, limestone, multiple cycles. not only we have different lithologies, but they represent completely different environments. The limestones are marine. They're shallow marine limestones. So there's very good flanger fossils we'll talk about in a minute. Okay? So the limestones were formed in the shallow sea, and they have a variety of different kinds of marine fossils in them from that time period. The mudstones, on the other hand, these variegated mudstones, actually represent fossil soils. Fancy name is paleosols, but you just call them fossil soils, ancient soils. And yes, soils can actually be preserved in the geologic record. They lithify, and that means they become hardened, like become rocks. But that they were originally soils, and actually a variety of different kinds of soils. But the big thing by saying they're soils is they're terrestrial. They're not marine, right? So that means we're going from not just limestone, mudstone, limestone, we're going marine environment, terrestrial environment, marine environment, terrestrial environment, marine environment, dozens of times. So it wasn't just that the Flint Hills represents time of an ancient shallow sea, which it does. It also represents an equal amount of time it was terrestrial, and they were alternating back and forth. So I can pass these around. These are commonly these mudstone rocks are often reddish or greenish in color, and both of these examples, what you see kind of little branching hollow tubes in this, or little green dendritic traces in that. Those are actually roots. So these are actually parts of the fossil soils, and these were all rooted by plants. So you pass these around. But this is what's in between those limestones. So what's that mean? Well, remember this is a glacial time. Lots of people think of glacial, like ice ages, the ice advances, and then it melts back, and that's your ice age. Isn't the way it works. Actually, the way a glacial episode works is that it's pulsational. So the ice advances a little bit, then it melts. It advances, and it melts. It advances, and melts. And then it melts back the same way. So it's always doing this alterations. Little advances, little retreats, advances and retreats. So when the ice is advancing, so you're adding ice to these giant ice sheets, where's the water coming from? Ocean. The ocean, right? So the water's evaporating from the ocean, being transported over the land, falls as snow. That snow gets compacted to ice, and so it doesn't run back into the oceans again. So you've kind of short-circuited the hydrologic cycle. Water doesn't flow back into the ocean, which means what happens to sea level? Drops. Right? Then, when the ice is retreating, that water's melting, flowing back into the ocean again, sea levels rise. So at the time, we're at the equator. We're 10 degrees north of the equator. There's no glacial action happening here. But the whole global sea level is going up and down. And it turns out that at this time, going all the way up through Kansas was very, very low topography coastal plain. So when the sea level rose, it flooded that coastal plain. It was a shallow sea. When the sea level went out, pulled the water away from it, it was now land, got vegetated, we have a landscape. And that happened dozens and dozens of times.
What time scale are you speaking of?
I always like students that anticipate what I'm going to say next. Again, this is just another example. This is a Blue Rapids. This is the 3 Mile limestone up here. Again, mudstone, limestone, limestone. These represent marine intervals. These represent terrestrial intervals. Here's your answer. during the Pleistocene Ice Age, because we can date things much better, we can date things much more accurately, in the Pleistocene Ice Age, further back in time you go, the more error bars there are, and the less precision there is in dating as you go back in time. But in the Pleistocene, we can still date things very, very precisely. And what we find is that the timing is the same thing was happening in the Pleistocene. The timing of these advances and retreats of the ice was the same as what are called Milankovitch cycles. What's a Milankovitch cycle? Well, it turns out that this has to do with changes in the Earth's orbit and inclination over time. So there are three aspects to these Milankovitch cycles. They were discovered by a guy named Milankovitch, of course. And one of them is that, as you probably know, the Earth's rotational axis isn't vertical. It's tilted. Okay, that's why we have our seasons. Okay? So the Earth's axis is tilted. And if you take it, and it's spinning, right? The Earth is rotating, but it's off axis. If you take a top, and you spin a top, and you spin it, and it's a little off axis, what does the top do? It wobbles, right? So what the Earth is doing is this. It's wobbling. Okay? And it takes 20,000 years to make one wobble. So it's wobbling really slowly on any kind of human time scale, but not in a geologic time scale. So it takes 20,000 years to do that once. Okay? In addition, the angle that the axis is called the tilt, or obliquity, this is the tilt of the Earth's axis, is also not constant. And it's going like this. Sometimes it's a little steeper, sometimes it's a little shallower. So to kind of exaggerate what the Earth is doing over time is this.
What is the difference between, the average is 23.5 degrees, right?
Yeah.
So what is
It's only about 2 or 3 degrees total. So it's not much, but the Earth's climate system is really sensitive, so it doesn't take much. So I'm really, really exaggerating that. But that takes 40,000 years to happen. Then there's another thing, and it's called eccentricity, and that refers to the orbit itself. The Earth's orbit around the sun is almost circular, but not quite. It's a little bit of elliptical. And how elliptical the Earth's orbit is changes over time. So sometimes it's more circular, and sometimes it's more elliptical, right? That takes 100 to 200,000 years to go through that cycle. You add up all those cycles on top of each other, and you get the Milankovitch periodicities, which is correlates perfectly with glacial and interglacial cycles of the Pleistocene. And as far as we can tell, was also controlling the glacial and interglacial cycles during the Pennsylvanian and Permian. So the answer is those sedimentary cycles, the big cycles are about 100,000 years, the small ones are about 20,000 years.
Could some of this explain why the continents are sort of distributing themselves around?
No. So this would have no impact on, it wouldn't have any impact on that. Yeah.
Would this rising and falling of the ocean levels during the terrestrial area time points, would that explain why we have a lot of fossils on the top of some of those mudstone layers? Like there'll be a lot of marine fossils on the terrestrial layer.
Okay. A couple points there. One is some of the, I'm just calling mudstone layers, particularly ones that are next to the limestone, sometimes alternating within a larger limestone interval, are actually not terrestrial. They're still probably very shallow, some of them maybe even like intertidal environments and things, but there's still marine intervals within the limestone. So there are shales that are marine, and thin kind of limey shales that are marine. The other thing is that within these mudstone packages, so again, if we go back, actually within here, I'm kind of simplifying things. There are actually often thin layers within these intervals that there are actually cycles in here. That's where the 20,000 year cycles are, is within. This would be 100,000 years. Okay, 20,000 year cycles are these smaller ones.
Wait a minute, should there be only 5 20,000 year cycles within 100,000 year cycles?
Yeah. Yeah, it's works out about that way. Yeah, you're right. So they're very hard to see oftentimes, but those smaller scales aren't as dramatic as the big ones. And so what you end up with is a soil, and then it was flooded. So the sea rose enough to flood the surface. You might get a thin layer that only maybe be a couple centimeters thick that has some fossils in it. And then there's another terrestrial package, and then another thin layer to have a few fossils in it. So you have these little thin fossil stringers interrupting it. And those are parts of the shorter term cycles. The bigger term cycles have these bigger, more prominent limestone layers.
When you say a shallow sea, how deep?
Another good question, and there's some debate. Not everyone would agree with me. But I say for the most part, you're probably dealing with a few tens of meters. I suppose there's a possibility that places might be as much as 100 meters, but that would probably be a downside. But yeah, we really is shallow. We're not talking about ocean type settings.
So are you pretty much referring to anywhere where there's coral is able to form? Would that be classified as shallow?
Yeah, and there actually very little coral at this time. Actually, corals were almost going extinct at this time. You can find some corals, but they're very rare in these rocks. And it's just because those groups called Paleozoic corals actually, by the end of the Permian, they go completely extinct. So all the more corals that we have in the coral reefs today didn't exist. That whole group of organisms did not exist at this time. The corals that were present at this time were a completely different group, and they went extinct at the end of the Permian. So corals, you're not very unlikely to find corals in the Konza.
How many layers on the 20 million year cycle? Major layers.
Again, I have to count them up, but
They have a profile in their handbook.
yeah, I don't know offhand. But again, it works out. In fact, the way they do it for these older rocks is because they can't date things like you can in the Pennsylvania or in the Pleistocene, where they can very precisely date things. Basically, what you have is a datable horizon up here, and datable horizon down here that may be separated by 2-3 million years, and then you count how many cycles there are in between, and you end up with intervals that are about the right magnitude, and that's as close as you can get. So what you just say is they're in the Milankovitch band, which means that you do the division and you end up with something between 20 and 100,000 years. So it's just a matter of
Keith, when you say 100 meters, if I put it in feet, the deepest probably would be 600 feet, 100 meters of the sea, probably?
Yeah.
Okay, very good, thank you.
On Konza, there are 12 layers of limestone exposed. 13 if you count the partial layer in the Eskridge shale. But it's hard to get the kids to understand sometimes that what they're seeing on Konza is only a small piece of that history.
Right, exactly. Right, this goes all the way Yeah, it starts in the Pennsylvanian, and it goes all the way through the early Permian. And what you see in the Konza is only a fraction of that time interval. So part of it's eroded off the top, and then if you drill down, you'd have multiple cycles that would continue on below what's exposed at the surface. So yeah, what you're seeing at the Konza is only a fraction of that time of glaciation.
So if you go, as you go towards, as you go east, then do you see those other layers that you're speaking of?
Yeah, so as you go east, you're going down section, and yeah, eventually the whole sequence is exposed to the surface by the time you get to southeast Kansas. So, but you just have to drive because the surface exposures get older and older as you go to the east.
The difference between us and eastern Kansas then is that we got the Flint, whereas eastern Kansas does not have a Flint.
Right, and the climate was different. One thing that was happening during this time is the climate was drying out. So and I don't have time to get into this, but the environment during the Pennsylvania was a much wetter time. There's coal beds out there, right? Southeast Kansas is where they used to have open pit coal mines. Okay, you don't have any coals here. There's no coals in the Konza. And the reason there aren't any coals is because it was a much drier climate. It was kind of a seasonal, wet, dry to kind of semi-arid climate. So when you had a terrestrial environment, it was too dry to produce anything approximating a coal bed. Whereas in the Pennsylvanian, those terrestrial times were wet times. And so you had extensive coal swamp vegetation. So it was a big climate change from the Pennsylvanian to the Permian. Okay, this is just to show the different patterns. This is eccentricity, so that's the change in the ellipticity of the Earth's orbit. This is the tilt. That's the slight changes in how tilted the Earth's axis is. And precession has to do with this wobble. And so you can see the different frequencies of those different kinds of processes. And that's reflected in the alternations in the rocks. Okay, so now I want to spend a little time just talking about what the environment was like here in the Flint Hills when these rocks were being formed. And not only is the paleogeography really different than it is now, but life was very different. So people might ask, well, was this the time of the dinosaurs or something like that? And it's older than that. Okay? So this particular time was shortly after the appearance of the first reptiles. First reptiles appear at the end of the Pennsylvanian. So this is very early in the history of terrestrial vertebrate life. There were amphibians before that. Amphibians extended back much further in Earth history. But first reptiles had only just appeared fairly recently. So you have primitive reptiles, no mammals, no dinosaurs, no birds, no flowering plants of any kind. Virtually every kind of plant that you see now, you see out in the prairie or you see in your backyard, did not exist. Okay? Completely different set of plants. Flowering plants did not appear until the Cretaceous, which is much later. So there were no flowering plants of any kind. No flowers, no nuts, no fruits, nothing. None of those plants existed at this time. So vegetation was very, very different.
There would have been quite a bit of insects though, right?
Plenty of insects.
Has there been, has anyone found bugs, dragonfly?
Not in the Konza per se, but yes. In fact, the entomology department in Kansas State has a collection of fossil insects from Kansas and from the Flint Hills area, but they're very rare deposits. Actually, there were some late deposits. Some of these things were found in. This is a late Pennsylvanian kind of reconstruction. with the time of appearance of the first reptiles. And again, this is end of the Pennsylvanian, very different kind of vegetation than we see today. So there's tree ferns, there's things called lycopsids or scale trees, sphenopsids. How many people are familiar with equisetum or horsetails? Right, horsetails. Horsetails are the only remnant of this group of plants, which were really common back then. They formed trees at that time, called calamites, big tall trees. You can imagine a horsetail that's 100 feet tall. So very different set of plants. And that changed on into the Permian. In the Permian we have things like cycads, which are palm-like trees, and ginkgos, probably familiar with ginkgos, or a primitive tree that is around today. But again, very, very different vegetation. You go into Permian and you have a somewhat more diverse set of reptiles. Everybody knows Dimetrodon, right? Most kids think they're dinosaurs. They're not dinosaurs, not related to dinosaurs. Things like Dimetrodon, the paleozoics would have been around at this time. These are amphibians. They're kind of like frogs on steroids. They're called labyrinthodonts, which would have dominated the seas at this time. So the point is a very, very different kind of world as far as biology is concerned. And one thing, just as a comment, you should not expect, and the kids should not expect, to find any plant fossils or bones or anything like that, because the kind of rocks that are preserved here in the Konza are mostly those paleosalts, those ancient fossil soils, and they're a lousy place to preserve stuff. Soils are very destructive environments. So anything that dies, think of a bison dying out on the prairie, nothing's going to be, another year or two, nothing's going to be left of that bison. It's going to be completely consumed, completely rotted away, scavenged, it's going to be gone, right? So you just don't preserve vertebrates in that kind of an environment. And the same with plants. Any plants that live there, they decay, they decompose, they become part of the soil, right? So, yeah, there are all these cool animals around, but sorry, you're not going to walk around and find a complete Dimetrodon skeleton laid out on the Konza. Just not going to happen. But the marine environment is different. Limestones. They're often hard to get out, particularly out of limestones. But I have most of the fossils out there. But just to run through some of the things that's possible to find, there are a variety of gastropods or snails. This is a fairly common one. It's called Staphylococcus. It's unusual because most snails, their shells coil out, so they spiral out, right? But this one is called planospiral, which is it's coiled like wrapping a rope or a hose, right? So it's coiled in one dimension or in two dimensions, which is peculiar for snails. So it's pretty diagnostic if you see it. If you see a flat coiled shell, it's probably one of these guys.
Are these extant genera? Are there representatives still around?
No, these are all extinct, but in some cases, some of the things we'll talk about, there are modern relatives, but all the genera and species are all extinct. Bivalves. There are, these are called myelinids. They're oyster-like, somewhat oyster-like clams. These are, like mussels, live kind of like mussels. This is a pecten, which is like a scallop shell. Okay, so these are all some of the clams that someone might find. These are some others. Remember I said there were clam burrows? These are the kinds of fossil clams that made those burrows. These are burrowing clams. I have an example of one of those out there. In some places in thin kind of limestone layers that probably represented intertidal environments or things like that, you find these small clams, small little elongated clams. They're only about a centimeter or so across. But the thing they're most likely to find, oh, I can pass it. These are some examples of myelinids clams. But one of the things they're most likely to find are these things called brachiopods, productive brachiopods. And I'll pass one of these around so you can see. This is just one valve, one shell, half of a shell for one of these. And these have these typical, they have one very convex shell like this, and then another kind of flat valve that sits on top of it. And the convex valve would have been on the bottom in the mud, and then the top valve would be like this. And they have these little bumps on the surface, which are actually the basis for spines. So these would have been really spiny in life. Lots of small spines sticking off the bottom, which kind of anchored them in the mud. And then the top shell would be on the top. These were the dominant organisms living on the bottom, on the seafloor at this time. Very, very common. In particular, these kinds of brachiopods were very common. Now, as far as you're concerned, I think if you just kind of, people find something, just being able to tell whether it's a clam, bivalve, or a brachipod is A-okay, right? And so, I don't expect people to be able to identify fossil species or genera or anything like that. So one question that I get is, how do you tell the difference between a clam and a brachipod? The animal inside is entirely different, absolutely entirely different. They're different phyla, right? Just because they have two shells with a hinge doesn't mean that they're related, okay? These are examples of other brachiopods that you can find that aren't those spiny kinds. But the easiest way to tell them, and so I guess I get to do my dance.
I was going to ask
is that their symmetry is different. If it's a clam, think of just like quintessential clam, clam on a half-shell clam, right? You look at one valve, and that valve is not symmetrical, right? Or think of a scallop shell or something, right? But the two sides of the two valves are mirror images of each other, right? You split a clam in half, the one half of the clam is a mirror image of the other half of the clam. So that would be like, with us, having your line of symmetry go this way, right? So a clam would have its hinge back here, and it would go like this. So this would be one valve, and this would be the other valve, and the symmetry line goes this way, right? On the other hand, the brachiopods, which are again a completely different phyla, they're a completely different organism living inside that shell, their symmetry line is this way. And that if you look at one valve is bilaterally symmetric. So you look at, so you can draw a line here, right? That side's the same as this side. This side's the same as this side. This side's the same as this side, right? So that each shell, each valve is bilaterally symmetric. So that's like the hinge being here, and so brachiopods are like this. Okay? This part of me is not the same as this part of me, but each part is bilaterally symmetric. Okay? So this is a brachipod, and this is a clam. So it's a really easy way to remember it. We get kids to remember the difference between a clam and a brachipod if they pick something up. The animal inside a brachiopods are living today. That phyla still exists. And the animal inside has these coiled, ciliated structures it uses to filter plankton out of the water. So you can see when it's opened up here, you can see those unique feeding structures, which what defines that group. And again, it's very different from a clam. There are also these things called inarticulate brachiopods. These will be in the black shales. They look kind of nondescript, either kind of oval-shaped or nearly circular. Again, there's some examples out there. It's another, also a different kind of brachiopod. They live buried in the sediment rather than living on top of the surface. Then there are bryozoans. These are examples of bryozoans. And bryozoans, believe it or not, are closely related to brachiopods. Whoa, what doesn't look much like a brachiopod? But these are actually colonies, and each one of these little openings here is an individual animal. Okay, so these are very, very tiny animals that form these colonial skeletons. But the individual animal has the same kind of a feeding structure as brachiopod does. So if you find these fossils, they either look like lace, or they're fine branching things. If you look at them really closely, they have like pinpricks all over, little holes covering the surface. Those are bryozoans. And these are magnifications of living bryozoans. And again, they have the same kind of feeding structures that occur inside those brachiopod shells, despite the fact that the fossils are dramatically different.
So they're not coral related, are they?
No.
At all?
No. No relation whatsoever. There are some corals, but again, they're very rare because they're going extinct. During the course of the Permian, what we call Paleozoic corals are going extinct. There's still some around, but they're not very common. Certainly not common in the Konza. Occasionally you'll find these guys, these little horn corals, but they're not very common.
Is it because it's too cold, or?
So actually, at the there's a couple of extinction events earlier in Earth history that knocked them down, and they never recovered, and then they just kind of petered out. And at the end of the Permian was the biggest extinction event in Earth history, and wiped them out as well as a whole host of other things go extinct at the end of the Permian.
Okay, so Keith, I've got a question for you. That's a lot of calcium carbonate out there. That's a lot of calcium carbonate. Who's giving it up?
Good question. Almost all limestone is produced by organisms. Not all. There are ways of producing it abiotically, but the vast majority of limestone that is deposited by the aid of organisms. That doesn't mean that they're built up of shells. Some of them are. Actually, one of the limestones that we'll look at, I'll pass around in a minute, is made up almost entirely of little fossils called fusulinids. So there are some limestones that are pretty much just composed of shells of fossils. But when I say biological, that can be bacteria, that can be algae, okay? But organisms are involved because the way the reaction that produces calcium carbonate is much easier to occur by biochemical process than by natural, non-biological processes. So one answer to that is where did all the the calcium carbonate come from? Well, it came from CO2, and it came from calcium ions. Where did the CO2 come from? The atmosphere. Okay? So CO2 dissolves in the water. Okay? So there's dissolved CO2 in the water that the organisms can pull from to secrete their skeletons. And calcium ions are produced by weathering. So weathering of rocks is producing all kinds of these, calcium ions and potassium and magnesium and iron and all these other ions that are getting washed into the sea. So there's calcium ions in there, sodium and other things. So those are produced by weathering into the oceans. And then when organisms secrete that calcium carbonate and falls to the bottom of the ocean and accumulates eventually as a limestone, particularly significance is that a lot of that, the carbon dioxide that was pulled out to make that is now come out of the atmosphere. So when you take carbon out of the atmosphere, you actually are storing it away now, taking it permanently out of the atmosphere and storing it in limestone. You do the same thing, this is a little bit of a digression, you do the same thing when you make like coal, for example. Now it turns out that this time period was one of the major coal deposition, particularly in the Permian and worldwide. Okay? The same thing, photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? Combines it with other chemicals to make their tissues, make plant tissues that then are compressed to turn into coal. So every time you make a coal bed, that's CO2 that came out of the atmosphere. So these things are taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. That means the CO2 levels in the atmosphere drop, which is probably one reason why we had an ice age. Because CO2 is a greenhouse gas. The more CO2 in the atmosphere, the warmer the global climate. You take the CO2 out, the global climate gets colder. And so this is the late Pennsylvania and early Permian is one of the largest times of coal deposition in Earth history. Where did all that coal come from? It came from the atmosphere. Okay, so that's kind of the side.
So the calcium carbonate would probably be most accurately described as a precipitate.
Yes.
From bacterial action.
And brachiopods and clams and everything else. I mean, everything is making a calcareous skeleton from plankton to algae to macroscopic
So it
fossils.
is their shells, but most of it is a precipitate. Shells and precipitate?
Well, the shells are a precipitate.
Okay.
So they're producing their shells by this biochemical reaction, and that organisms can do it a lot better than you can to produce the proper chemical conditions to precipitate out without organisms involved. So a couple other things. Lots of people find these things look like little beads. These are stem segments from crinoids. So here's a crinoid. You're hardly ever going to find one like this. Okay, this is a complete crinoid. Here's the body. Here's the stem that anchored it to the seafloor. And when these things die, those little individual calcium carbonate plates disintegrate, fall apart into pieces. So the limestones will find lots of these little kind of discs or beads, look like little poker chips, lots of them. Okay, and they're actually stem segments and arm segments from crinoids. Think of crinoids are echinoderms. They're kind of like taking a starfish, turning it upside down, and sticking it on a stem. Okay, and so they're immobile. They're anchored to the seafloor, and they're upside down with their feeding arms up in the water column like that. Another thing that a lot of in this are sea urchins. Again, they fall apart when they die, and you'll find sometimes these are segments. They have these little knobs on them, and that's where the spines were attached. So these are segments from the body of the sea urchin, and then you'll find the sea urchin spines. You'll find these little straight spikes or spines. Those were the spines of sea urchins, which were actually quite abundant. Yep.
And what were the seawater and chemistry and temperature conditions that led to deposition instead of erosion?
I'm not quite sure.
I mean, why didn't the dead calcium carbonate shells dissolve back into the ocean water?
Ah, okay. Actually, with calcium carbonate, they're not liable to redissolve. Actually, they're more likely to be destroyed by the organisms that will bore into or otherwise destroy shells. There are shell-crushing organisms that can crush. Most of it's biological destruction. You're not going to dissolve the shells in the ocean unless you have high acidity conditions. And that occurs in the deep ocean. The deep ocean is more acid. So you don't accumulate limestone in the deep ocean. It's called the carbonate compensation depth. You go below a certain depth in the deep ocean and you don't accumulate limestone anymore because it's too acid down there. So any shells or anything that falls below that level just get redissolved. But we're very shallow here. So that wouldn't happen unless there were local higher acidity conditions in the seafloor. These are just living crinoids and sea urchins. And these are forams. I'll circulate these guys. This is from the Cottonwood Limestone. We'll see this. One of the most diagnostic limestones in the Konza. Lots of buildings. So is that Cottonwood? A lot of building stones in Manhattan are made of this. It's a very attractive building stone. And it's made almost entirely of fuselids. And fuselids look like little wheat grains. So you can see, and here's a bag of fuselids. So you can see it just almost exactly the size and shape of wheat grains. So here they are. You can see a surface. But these are actually single-celled organisms. These are called forams, foraminifers. They're actually a single-celled organisms producing these very incredibly fabulous, beautiful shells. And here's a microscopic image of a cross-section through one of them and see how elaborate the inside of these things are. And to think that these are produced by a single-celled organism is pretty cool. The organism themselves is the closest thing that you might be familiar with is an amoeba. These are amoebic cells that are actually producing shells or tests. So they send out little pseudopodia through openings in the shell and capture organic matter and plankton in the water and pull it in and digest it. So these are zooplankton. And they exist today, but not the same kinds. The fuselids are extinct, but there are forams. And here's a foram shell, and you can see all this little thread-like pseudopodia extending out as it's capturing stuff from the water column and digesting it. So these are actually single-celled organisms, which is pretty amazing, I think. I think that's a cool thing to point out. These little wheat grain things represent one single cell. And there are some stromatolites. I know Earl has seen these things in the bottom of lowest area within the Konza. You can sometimes find these. And these are built up by algae. These are algal mounds that grew on the seafloor. What I wanted just to bring this to a conclusion is there's another set of sediments that occur in the Flint Hills, in addition to the rocks of the late Pennsylvania and early Permian, and that's from the Pleistocene, right? Which is kind of cool in that the Permian was formed during an ice age, 270 million years ago. Then there's a 270 million year gap. And then there's Pleistocene stuff on top of that formed by the recent ice age. So you have two sets of sediment all produced during an ice age separated by 270 million years of erosion and non-deposition. So here's the world in the Pleistocene with advancing northern hemisphere ice sheets. And one of those advances extended as far as northeastern Kansas. Didn't quite get here. But what we would have been here is on what's called the Outwash Plain, out in front of the glacier. So if you go up to like parts even Wabunsee County, is where the edge of the ice was. So you're not that far away. So you're pretty close to as far as the ice came. But you're here where all the ice was melting. And all the sediment that was in that ice is melting and being carried out by these meltwaters out from the front of the ice. And that caused two things. One is filling in valleys, or valley fills, where sediment was floated and kind of redid the topography, so valleys were filled up with sediment. So it changed the whole topography of the area. There are lake deposits, glacial lake deposits, and there's things like this, which is called loess, which is these boring, uninteresting, totally homogeneous hunks of silt and fine sand, which are sitting on top of the landscape, and they're windblown. So imagine out in front of the ice, you have all this sediment. Ice carries everything from house-sized boulders to rock flour in the ice. And when it melts, you have all this different kind of sediment. But the fine stuff, when it dries out in the dry season, the wind can blow across that and pick up that dust, pick up that fine sediment and blow it away. And it piles up. So this is called loess. It's wind-blown, fine sediment coming from the front of the glaciers. And so here is 270 million year old Permian rocks, and there is, million year old Pleistocene loess on top of it, even less than that. This is from it just went blank. Doesn't matter. But what you see here is this is actually an ancient valley. These are places. What?
Milford?
Yeah, this is Milford. That's right. Thanks. This is Milford. This is an ancient valley. This is all loess sediment that's filled it in. So you wouldn't even see this valley on the surface because the whole valley had been filled in by glacial sediments. And it only reappeared, and this is in '93 with a flood that washed that loess off the top and re-exposed this ancient buried valley underneath. And then, of course, there are erratics. This is in Wabunsee. This is boulders that have been carried down from South Dakota. We actually know precisely where these rocks came from. It came from the Sioux Quartzite, which is in South Dakota. They were carried all the way down to Kansas in the ice. And that's where they came from. You pointed, right? This is where they came from. Ice rolled over this area, picked up these hard quartzite boulders, carried them all the way down to Kansas and dropped them there when the ice melted. So the surface of the ground can be littered, not in Konza because the ice didn't get this far. But you don't just go to Wabunsee County and you can see boulders from these rocks on the surface. So I'm done.
How does the oil deposits fit into the geological history here?
Not directly to this time period. There are some of these rocks in western Kansas in the subsurface, where they're very far below the surface, act as reservoirs. In other words, you have to have two things to have an oil reserve. One is you have to have a source of the organic material, which is usually from someplace else. So you have to have organic rock, rich rock from somewhere that get heated to proper temperatures and so forth so that it becomes liquefied. It then has to flow through the rocks and then get trapped someplace. And some of the rocks where those liquid petroleum products are trapped is in some of these Permian rocks in southeast in what's called the Hugoton embayment, which is southwest part of